Welcome to Coffee with Kelly. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, and on today's episode, we're taking a closer look at what it takes to keep our schools safe and secure. From the roles and responsibilities of school staff to the actions we can all take to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. We'll be diving into the vital importance of school safety and the role we all play in making our schools a safer place for everyone. So join us and get ready to learn the essential knowledge to keep our schools safe and secure. Well, good morning, Kelly. Do you have your coffee at hand?
I do.
How do you drink your coffee, by the way? I think our viewers might want to know that.
Black.
That's how I drink it as well.
I drink cowboy coffee.
Cowboy coffee. Is that what you call it?
It is.
All right.
If you want the best cup of coffee,
Yeah.
look up how to make cowboy coffee.
Okay. All right. I will do that.
All right.
How to make cowboy coffee. I'm intrigued.
Right?
So, going off of the recent blogs that we've been putting out, Kelly, do you want to kind of give a brief overview of what those talked about in case some of our listeners haven't got a chance to read those yet?
Sure. So we recently published our first two blogs and more are on the way. But most recently, we looked at the overview of school safety and how our education professionals, lifelong learners, how they engage in the safety process. Just real quickly going over the overview of school safety and what that means is an entire ecosystem of disparate systems that are working together for the purpose of identifying, preventing, mitigating, preparing for, response to, and recovery from school emergencies and crises. And why I emphasize the word ecosystem is primarily because I feel that we're kind of going about the school safety process a little bit backwards in that we look at the last incident and we try to figure out what went wrong in that last incident. And then we create some mandate, some law, something that is meant to prevent the next incident from occurring. But really what we should be looking at is this culture of safety within our school that has programs, training, processes, responses to very low-level things, interventions, monitoring programs to help us prevent something from occurring. And you need a whole system of systems, an ecosystem. And the reason I say that is because when we look at the mandates and the new laws that come out after a recent incident, they're looking to solve a problem that was identified that if that problem had been resolved before the event, likely the event may not have occurred. We can't say that for 100% certainty, but they're trying to solve that problem. But we're not really trying to solve the problem because every incident is different. And sure, we learn lessons on what we should have done or could have done, but we're never going to see another problem, another incident exactly like that. So we really have to look at holistically, how do we solve the problem? How do we respond to the problem if we can't solve that problem? And so we need things like access control, visitor management, threat and behavior assessments, interventions, and disciplinary actions. We need the ability to bring all of these things together so that they work towards solving the problem.
So when you're talking about access control in a school, like I can think about it in terms of like a business. What is acceptable in terms of access control with the school? Do we have full-on metal detectors? Do we have like the scanning devices that you'd see like in a TSA environment? Like what can and can't do in a school environment?
So you can do all of that, right?
Even a TSA?
Sure.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, you can. I mean, all you need is money, right? The fact is we, and I think I talked about this before to many people, we can make your school look like a prison.
Right.
We can have that level of access control, right? But is that what your school wants? Is that what your community wants? Maybe. I don't know. But we have to look at that balance, right?
Right.
The point of access control is understanding who is in your building and what they're doing in your building, right? So we always look at access control as a single point of entry, maybe scanning, maybe checking in, that kind of stuff, right? But really what it is controlling the access to those who have legitimate business there and only those people who have legitimate business there. So having a single point of entry is a good idea. That way you don't have to spread your staff around to multiple entry points and you can monitor everyone coming through. Do you check in? And if you check in, do you check in all students, all staff, all parents, visitors, those things? Those are all things that are driven by your policy. And when we're talking about how you do something, let's start with the basics and policies, right? Your whole safety system and program should be driven by policy of the school board, of the state, of your local education agency, in that they're the ones that set up what access control should look like. They're the ones that set up what your expectations should be, what your procedures are, what your training should be, how often you should be trained, and so forth.
So you talking about like a school board, is that what you would define as the safety team? Or is that a completely different group of people?
So the school board is completely different. They should have a hand in it, obviously. Most school boards that I'm familiar with kind of take a hands-off approach and they rely on the superintendent or assistant superintendents to monitor that safety program. A safety team. So if we get into safety teams, there's a couple of different levels. A building level, there should be a safety team at each school. There should be a safety team for the district. And the safety team at the district level, they're responsible for developing the safety program, the safety plans, expectations, the implementation of the program and the plans, who should be trained, what their roles, who's in those roles, those types of things. But the school board, they're kind of really responsible for providing funding, policy, oversight, and they're the ones that should be asking, how are we doing? Are we in compliance? Are we safe? And if we're not safe, why not? And what do we need to do to get there?
Okay, so it's, even though they're not directly responsible for the day-to-day, they still need to know what's going on. So that the communication between the safety team and the school board needs to still be there, because the school can't implement the technology, let's say, if they don't have funding to do so, right?
Right. So ultimately, the school board's the one responsible. They're the elected official. They're the elected governing body of that school district, right? So ultimately, they're responsible. They can't just rely on a annual report. That's not sufficient. They need to have somebody. There should be a safety committee with a school board member or two that are actively involved with that process. But from a governing perspective, what do you need from me to be safe, right? What are our compliance mandates? Are we meeting them? How do we meet them? How do we report those? Are we doing that? What do we need to do? That type of stuff.
Right. If someone on the school board felt that it wasn't their responsibility to be part of that conversation, let's say you were tasked to help them with security and they said, that's not my responsibility, how would you respond to that?
I mean, the obvious answer is that school safety is a shared responsibility. We've heard that many, many times. Most people that comes out of their mouth fairly easy. It's a shared responsibility. But what does that actually mean, right? It doesn't mean there's a committee and that's their responsibility, so I'm not doing something. what school safety, a shared responsibility, means that everyone has a role, a responsibility. Now, that's where we kind of come in and look at what are our roles. I'm a teacher. What is that role? I'm a superintendent, an assistant superintendent. What is my role? How do I fit into this whole program, this whole process? And I lay it out in very basic terms in the blog, and we can go over that real quick, right? The school board is the governing body. Their primary function is looking at the funding, policies, oversight, compliance, those types of issues, right? The superintendent is handed those mandates from the school board. And the superintendent looks at state mandates, how much funding they have, and kind of starts looking at how do we look at the funding that we have, the mandates that we have, how do we get that going? So likely the assistants and the assistant superintendents say we need a safety coordinator, somebody who's responsible for this. So that safety coordinator is really looked at to be responsible for developing the safety program, looking for who needs to be trained, identifying roles, who's in what roles, and so forth. Assistant superintendents, depending on the size of the districts, you may have an assistant who's in charge of secondary education. Their job is really oversight of secondary. Are our high schools trained? Do the students know what to do? Do the teachers know what to do? Are our principals on top of their individual schools? Do they know what they're expected to do, and are they doing it? The principals are culturally, they're the head of that school, right? And they're the ones that are responsible for everything that happens there. So they have to look at their own development process of their building safety team, identifying who that is, what their responsibilities are, and ensure that they have the resources that they need to work through their jobs. And then you work down to the assistants, the assistant principals. The APs are often the ones that are tasked with implementing the safety program at the school. So they're looking and saying, okay, what do I need to do? What programs are there? How do I get this done? Who do I need help from for training? What are the mandates and so forth? Then you look at the teacher's responsibility. The teacher is really the frontline worker who is dealing with the immediate response to something, what we call emergency protective actions. And those are lockdown, secure, shelter, evacuate, hold, those types of things in response to a crisis or an emergency. So their job is really critical in that they're the first immediate response staff to anything that's happening because they're likely there. So they have to protect their children. They have to account for their children. They have to communicate with the school safety team. They have to communicate with first responders, those types of things. So those are the roles, the basic roles within the district. There are obviously more, and we could get into more in depth at a later date if we wish, but those are the basic roles. And when we're talking about the safety of a school, it's not only when something happens, what do I do? And when we talk about the safety program, and let's take the quote unthinkable incident, right? An active shooter, active violence, right? And we hear about it the day that it occurs, at the point that it occurs. But we also know in doing our analysis of the events that oftentimes these things started many years before, when a kid was being bullied. There was mental health issues. There were violence issues. There were all of these things that were seen many years before, but we didn't address them then. So they became problems later. And so FEMA likes to categorize the safety process, the emergency process, into 4/5 different categories. Prevention, mitigation, sometimes those two are together because they work hand in hand together. Preparedness, response, and recovery. And everything that we do we're in one of those phases, or sometimes multiple phases at any given time. But the prevention phase, and what a lot of our schools really like to focus on, is the prevention. Should we focus there? Yes. But you can't rely on 100%, I'm going to prevent this from occurring, because then you get into this false sense of security that I have the ability to prevent. We don't have the ability to prevent everything from occurring. We can't take every contingency into account and make sure that we do that and make sure that we prevent. So we have to look at the prevention. We have to look at identifying those behaviors, those concerns, those situations and circumstances, and fixing them, whether it's a child who's struggling, a child who's being bullied, showing mental health issues, or it's a door that doesn't lock that's supposed to.
It can really be that simple,
right?
Because that's kind of what happened in a recent shooting, right? That the person got through an unlocked door,
right, or a door that wasn't secured, right?
Right.
Yeah, and sometimes it is as simple as shutting the door or getting a door fixed that's been broken for years. Right. It just, and having a process for that.
So, in reading your blog, one of the points that I'd be interested for you to expand on a little bit was you talked about how your team would train for events, right? And you kind of hit on it before, the unthinkable, most of your line staff thought it would never happen, but then it did, and then weren't prepared for it. And then you basically mentioned that because of this, it cost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars more than it should have. So like there was a very negative outcome to that because they weren't prepared.
So this is where I think we get into what some of our staff at Crisis Go likes to call Kelly's stories. And these stories are meant to really bring out a point or emphasize a point that we're trying to make. When we're looking at understanding our roles and training and what's necessary for us to train for any particular incident, we have to train as though it is actually going to happen. And I know a lot of people push back on that. From the law enforcement perspective, we've gotten a lot of pushback that the training for active violence situations is causing trauma. The training itself. What I like to look at is what would happen if you didn't train. You could have done something and you didn't, because you didn't want to train because you were afraid of getting traumatized by the training itself. We found in law enforcement, military finds it an awful lot, that the more realistic the training is, the more resilient you become to the trauma caused by that incident. Does that mean you're not going to have trauma? No. But it is likely that you're going to have a lot less trauma caused by that if you had trained than if you had not. But going back to the question itself, was every year there's, in the jurisdiction that I worked in California, there were two very large non-sanctioned events. It was in a college town. And of course, college students like to have a party. And for many years, as long as I can remember, there was these two large events. One of them was Halloween, and the other one was a spring party. And as a result of this, there's in this very small area that students would pack sometimes upwards of 50, 60, even 70,000 people. They'd have friends from all over the country come in. It was just this very large party. A lot of alcohol, a lot of things that go along with too much alcohol and college kids.
Yeah, that's a bad recipe.
Right. And so in law enforcement, as we see the results of that, it became very apparent to us that there was a high likelihood that there would be an incident of complete, total civil unrest. There could be, right? So for many, many years, we trained a week or two before each of these events. We'd bring all of our deputies in and we would train them in riot control and civil unrest response. And we do this religiously. I mean, okay, it's that time of year again. We need to get the training for riot control. And we did that. And then in 2014, we had an incident. It was sparked by a very small, relatively common incident where a young person was resisting arrest with an officer and a struggle ensued. And then from that, it just exploded into this full-on civil unrest. And we had predicted it. We had trained for it. But the problem was that we had been training for it for so long that we got to a point that we thought it would never happen. And our leadership team was stunned. They didn't know what to do. And I was in the field and I responded to the area and I became the infield incident commander for that. And I started taking the initial response actions and organizing my deputies, right? But there was this disbelief in the incident management team or the command structure that what was occurring. And so there was this disconnect. The point being is it took them a long time for them to realize what was occurring and for them to really, what I call, wrap their arms around what was happening to them and responding appropriately. So the point of that is to really illustrate the reason you train is because it can happen. And you have to train as though it's going to so that you can reduce that reactionary gap time and respond appropriately quickly and get your arms wrapped around, I call it the hour of chaos. But that hour of chaos, which is where you're trying to figure out what's going on, can be very quick or it can be very slow and take days. And I've seen it both ways when you have a team that doesn't quite understand what's going on.
One of my thoughts here, Kelly, is for a team of law enforcement, you know, they're trained in these kind of situations. Like that's a pretty big part of their job and their training. And for them to kind of lose that understanding of like this could happen, right? You're training, you just keep training, like, and it's like, okay, you get to the point where they were probably saying, you know, why are we doing this? Like it's obviously never going to happen, but then it did happen. And I think, how do we encourage professionals in education to understand that training is important? Like it could happen. How do we encourage them to keep with it, basically, is what I'm asking. How do we encourage them to like just keep doing it? Because if it doesn't happen, that's great. But if you stop training and it does happen, then that's even worse.
Right. So the first thing is you got to get to a level of competency that you have the confidence in yourself and your staff that they're going to respond appropriately. Right. But then you have to keep it going, the training frequently. Right. And we have to remind people this can happen. It's happening often, way too often. It can happen and it can happen here, and just keep that in the conversation. Right. Making sure that people, one, develop a level of competency that gives them self-confidence that they can respond and they know what to do. And there's a saying in professional athletes that say you should train not till you get it right, but till you can't get it wrong.
I like that one.
So that's the kind of commitment that we need from our school staff and our administrators that say, this could happen here. We hope it's not, but hope's not a strategy. But we know that it can. And when it does, we will be ready for it. And if we keep that in that mindset, then we can respond, and we may not be able to prevent everything, but we can have an long-term impact in the safety of our schools, our community, the reduction of trauma to everyone involved. And, you know, that's really what it's about, right? Is saving everyone possible and reducing the trauma, both physical and emotional, to everyone who's touched by that. And I will tell you that the breadth of people who are touched by an incident at school is crazy big. It goes well beyond your community. And look at it. Look at the leaders of the schools who did it correctly versus the trauma caused by the leaders who didn't do it correctly. And I don't have to name any specific incident, but you can find those pretty easily. The difference in the trauma, the anger, the hurt people feel when their leadership fails them. And their leadership fails them when they're not prepared properly and they're not doing it correctly.
And that just creates a whole nother thing of problems, because
sure.
Then the parents and all the people in the community just lose trust.
Right.
And what happens if you're a parent, you don't trust your school to protect your kid.
And what happens to the school district that gets sued for $27 billion with a B or $100 million because they didn't act correctly?
Yeah. Does that happen? So
sure.
I'm obviously coming from someone who's not as experienced in that as you. So I mean, it's
sure.
Hopefully, it's a question that maybe some of our listeners would also have. But
yeah, it happens. I mean, what's the remedy for a parent who lost a child during an event? Lawsuits, right? What do lawsuits do? They look to blame. They look to identify something that went wrong and put blame and attach a monetary value to that. So it happens all the time. And the numbers that I threw out there, 27 billion with a B and 100 million, were actual figures that have been tossed around by recent events.
That would be devastating for a school.
Yeah. It'd be devastating for anybody, right?
Yeah. And that just further hurts everyone involved, all the students.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So a little while ago, you hit on administrators, a little bit of responsibility. And another point that I highlighted in your recent blog was administrators being concerned about time in terms of training staff and safety procedures. And I thought that was interesting because for me, from an outside perspective, time should be made for safety procedures. I personally would view safety as a pretty high priority. So it's same thing if you're, making a budget, if you're spending money on things you don't need and you're like, oh, I don't have enough money to pay my mortgage. Well, the mortgage should come first and then everything after that. So it's kind of the same mentality, I would think.
Right. Yeah. And I understand it. The schools are in this constant search of balance, and their primary purpose, their primary mission is the education of our children. And it's an important mission. Nobody's going to argue that. But there are mandates in every state that I'm aware of that in order for them to meet their mission, there has to be a certain number of instructional hours. So our school systems have really filled every minute they can with that. And then every minute that's left over from that instructional time is meant for professional development so that they can further educate their teachers and so forth, right? But it's been a struggle for a lot of safety professionals within the schools to get the time necessary for the training of staff on a regular basis, right? And it's tough to even run a drill because it cuts into instructional time. It is very difficult to train the basic responsibilities to every teacher at the beginning of the new school year in their basic responsibilities, to refresh the ones that are there, to retrain the ones that need it, to train those who have changed roles or schools, and to train the substitute teachers, the new employees who are coming into the district, the itinerant workers, the ones that travel around from school to school. They have a different role. They have a different responsibility. And it takes a lot, but they have to make that commitment, and they have to make sure that their staff understands that commitment and why it's there. Because if you address those things appropriately, then other things become less distracting. If you have a school safety culture infused into everything that you do, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in February, but creating a culture where safety is talked about at every level, then it becomes second nature and you don't have to put time aside. It just becomes part of what you do. And it works really quite a lot better. But it's tough at the beginning to get that flow going. But once you get that flow going, it just works almost effortlessly.
Yeah, like it needs to be second nature.
Right?
We need to get to that point where we're not having to really put too much thought into what do I do here? How do I react to this situation? It's like, I know how to react to this.
Right. Yeah. This is, one of the things that I struggle with.
You don't struggle with anything.
Yeah, no, I do. But I struggle with this because of the incongruity of what's being said versus what is being done, right?
Yep.
Safety is a first priority. The education, we want to create lifelong learners. And what does that mean? Because we all know that very few, if any, of our educators got into their profession saying, I'm getting into this because I want to protect my children. They didn't get in there to be safety professionals.
Right.
We all know that.
Yep.
But the fact of the matter is that's part of their role. And we have to keep up with that. And many of our education professionals are reluctant to learn that responsibility. They're afraid to fail at it. They're afraid that something might really happen. Yet that's contrary to this whole concept of lifelong learners. Lifelong learners have to be willing to accept that there's something that's going to make them feel uncomfortable. When you are uncomfortable and you're learning, that's when you learn the best from my perspective.
I agree.
Look at when you fail. What do you learn? Am I learning when somebody tells me the correct answer? Most of us would say no. I didn't learn. I didn't earn that knowledge when somebody told me that. It was just a fact. It was just something that somebody told me. It's when we learn and we've earned the knowledge based upon understanding what we were supposed to do, somebody telling us what we should do, showing us what we should do, us taking that information and then performing what we were supposed to do, applying it, then that's when we really learn. And that's when we can start looking from expanding from a basic level of knowledge to this expert level of knowledge and apply those basic concepts into anything that we do, right? That's when we start really looking at the application of knowledge into any given situation. And, nobody expects anybody, to come in on Monday and say, I'm a teacher. Okay, here's your stuff. Now you're an expert. Nobody expects that. We didn't do that with our kids, right? We go through this whole building process that starts in pre-K, kindergarten, all the way up through 12th grade, college, graduate school, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So we're taking 20 years to educate people in whatever it is they feel like they should be educated in. And yet some of the, quote, lifelong learners aren't engaging in that process.
Now, do you think that that's happening just off of, they see it as an inconvenience, or is it like, I don't have time, or that's not my role?
So there's a lot of excuses as to why it's not happening. There's a lot of reasons as well. Some of it's time, some of it's not my role, but I think we've put that to rest. It is your role. It is your responsibility. You need to make time for it. But as a lifelong learner, you would think you would want to explore this side of life, because it's not just in the schools we're talking about. A lot of these teachers are young. They have young families, and they're going to places that are public gathering, restaurants, shopping, movie theaters, sporting events. And the reality is these things that we're talking about can happen anywhere.
And they do.
And they do.
Yeah.
And in fact, that they happen more often outside of the school than inside of the school, right? So we really should be looking at training our students and our staff for a lifelong process of being safe and what they should be doing to be safe and what to do if something happens after they graduate, right? We're sending kids to be professionals and we're educating them to be productive adults. Why don't we train them to be safe as well?
It's almost like we need a whole new curriculum based on this, just as we have math and science and English. It's like we need a situational awareness class.
We can do that without actually having a curriculum for it.
Yeah.
But, right. But we can, right?
Yeah.
And we should.
I mean,
we should be teaching people that.
Because, I mean, just imagine if tomorrow everyone had that ability to have that situational awareness of potential threats.
Right.
I think that would change a lot of things.
Yep.
What are the benefits of being an active participant in a safety process?
So there are huge benefits in being actively involved in the safety of a school, safety of your community, and your own personal safety. Once you gain competency, you start gaining confidence. And not just confidence in emergency response, but confidence in yourself that you can protect yourself and that you can protect others. And you know what to do. So with that confidence, you build resiliency. You reduce the trauma. We've talked about that a little bit. You also, by actively engaging in the safety process, you actually increase the probability of survival of any incident, and you decrease the likelihood that those incidences are going to occur in the first place. By you actively engaging in it, you're actively looking at what can I do to prevent it? What can I do if I can't prevent it to mitigate the effects of it? What should I do in response to an incident? How do I prepare? How do I recover from it? When do I get involved? And when do I become an active safety member of this community that we have? So I know there's many that I list in the blog itself,
Yep.
That I probably didn't touch on, but just problem solving and critical thinking become better because you're looking at things differently. You're looking at how does this open door that I just passed relate to school safety? What should I do with that? It's just an open door. Should I shut it? Should I lock it? Should I tell somebody about it? Should I do something about it? Maybe it's broken. Maybe I need to have it fixed, right? So you just start thinking about things differently. Your thought processes, your critical thinking, your problem solving, all of these things come up and are much better when you are engaged in this type of process, right? One of the biggest things that it does is if students are confident that they're safe at school and that you as a teacher or a staff member at a school care about what goes on there and they see you actively involved in it, they're going to be better students.
100%.
Your parents are going to have much more confidence in your abilities. They're likely to become more engaged in the school process. They're likely to support you better. They're likely to be just not in your face all the time, right? I mean, it happens. What are you doing? Well, this is what we're doing. And if they come back time and time again with questions and you have the right answers and you can show and demonstrate them that this is what you are doing to keep their kids safe, they relax a little bit, right?
That's a key point, is making that environment a little bit more comfortable so that, as a student, you don't have to worry about what could happen. You have trust in your teacher.
Right. One of my bosses said, when I asked, I said, what's your goal for your students? And she said that, we really want our kids to meet their potential. And I said, that's a noble goal, right? We want every kid. And in fact, their slogan was every kid, every opportunity, every day. And I said, that's a noble goal. But you realize kids can't meet their potential if they don't feel safe. If they're worried about going to school, they're worried about, the basic needs in life, they can't meet their potential. And until they feel safe, they're not actually safe. So you have to do everything. You can't just say, oh, you're safe. That's not working for them. You need to demonstrate that they're safe. And you need to do that by engaging in this process.
I always enjoy listening to stories, Kelly, and it's I could listen for quite a long time, but thank you for obviously your time and your expertise and your input. If you were to conclude this with just kind of like a high level, what are some of the key points that our listeners can take away from this episode?
So really understanding that school safety and learning about school safety, your roles and responsibility, is a continuing, never-ending process of educating yourselves, your staff, your public, your families, your community, and really understanding that the process also includes several different systems that need to all work together to keep your school safe. And the connective tissue to all of these systems, in order for them to work properly, is the human involvement in those systems and processes that is necessary to bring them all together, understanding those relationships, understanding whose roles are needed when, and what your role is particularly, and what you might be expected to do, and how does that all fit into the whole emergency response and management model of prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery? And then what's going to happen when your first responders show up? What are those expectations? Are you going to wait till something happens before you get their involvement? Probably you shouldn't. But understanding that and educating yourself and actively participating in that educational process is key to doing everything that we can to make your school safe, make your community safe, and for you to have a successful school educational environment.
That's all for today's episode. We hope that you found this information valuable and that you have a better understanding of the roles and responsibilities of school staff in keeping our schools safe. Remember that knowledge is power, and by understanding our roles and responsibilities, we can all play a part in making our schools a safer place for everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that notification bell to stay updated on future episodes. And please head over to our website at crisisgo.com and leave a comment with your thoughts on today's episode. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening and stay safe.